Maltby is joining us from London. And
No, from Oxford. I'm in Oxford.
Oxford, got it. She's back in Oxford. Judith Maltby was born and raised in Illinois, but now she's retired. She's an emerita faculty from a member of Christ Church History Department, Corpus Christi College, Oxford, an honorary canon of Christ Church, Oxford, and the emerita canon theologian of Leicester, Winchester Cathedral. Her presentation is entitled Vassar Miller, 1924 to 1998, poet, disability activist, and Episcopalian.
Thank you. I think that was Joan, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, right. Well, it's good to be with you even remotely at your conference. I'm sorry I couldn't get to the States at this particular time of year. Well, I'm going to talk to you about Vassar Miller, who I suspect very few people have heard of. But I hope you'll see why she's so important by the time I finish. Could I ask how long the session is? Is there time for questions afterwards?
Yes.
Or anything like that?
30 minutes, and then we'll have questions afterwards.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with two prose quotations from Vassar Miller to set the scene, which are on the handout. I thought you'd have the handout physically, sorry.
We do.
Yeah.
Could you have the first slide, or then the second slide, please? I can't tell if you can see them or not. Can you see them?
Yes.
So, right, you see any way that I can see them too, or?
Does that work?
That's perfect. So I'm going to start with two prose quotations from Vassar Miller to set the scene. These are on the handout. In an essay entitled What is a Poet, published in 1966, she comments, Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone, but he said it to the devil, not to the hungry multitudes whom he fed. 20 years later, she wrote in the introduction to her groundbreaking literary anthology on physical disability, thought to be the first of its kind, despite this flesh, quote, I have often been told, if you weren't handicapped, you probably wouldn't write poetry. Now these two quotes bring together important aspects of this remarkable, largely forgotten poet. Miller's achievements as a poet, as a Christian, and as a Christian intellectual, her life lived with cerebral palsy, and her activism in the emerging disability rights movement. In addition to Despite This Flesh, Miller was the author of 9 volumes of distinguished poetry. Her second, Wage War on Silence, 1960, garnered her a nomination for the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1961. That's very serious recognition. She became Poet Laureate of Texas, multiple winner of the Texas Institute of Letters Award, incorporated into the state's Hall of Fame for Women, and to this day there is a poetry prize named after her. Yet all the contributors to the one book-length study of her, though it's only 175 pages, after assessing and praising her poetic achievements, repeatedly tussle with the question, why is Miller and her work not better known? So how have I come to be working on Miller, and how did I stumble across her? Until recent years, my academic work has been on parish religion after the Reformation in England, in particular, the reception of the Book of Common Prayer. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. Books like Prayer Book and People and Religion in Revolutionary England. But I've always had an interest in what you might call Anglican literary culture, the way fiction and poetry, as much as sermons, formal theological works or liturgical texts, shape Anglican Christianity and beyond it. Could we have I've got quite a few slides, so could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. That led to a very enjoyable project edited with Alison Schell called Anglican Women Novelists. My own chapter in that book was on the wonderful 20th century British novelist Rose Macaulay, not only as a novelist, but as an Anglican apologist. I'm afraid we decided you had to be British and dead to be in the book, so we couldn't include people like Madeline Ingle, who we would have liked to. My work on Vassar Miller is therefore part of a wider academic interest in Anglican literary culture, and in particular the contribution, often overlooked, of women to it. So you may have guessed from that Miller, though not a cradle Anglican like Macaulay, but became one by choice. She became an Episcopalian in her 20s and spent the rest of her life as a member of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Houston's Museum District. If we could have the next slide, please. There's St. Stephen's. Miller was a decidedly, however, ecumenical Christian with wide Roman Catholic contacts, as well as attending a progressive Baptist church in Houston. I think it is important what first drew my interest to Miller was that she was a very good poet, then Anglican, and then female. I only discovered about her disability later, and I think she would have liked it that way. Next slide, please. The first poem of Miller's I ever read was in this anthology, Chapters into Verse, a 2-volume anthology which links Anglophone poetry to 5 centuries, Anglophone poetry over 5 centuries to specific biblical purposes. Those of you who have to preach, it's quite a useful resource. Now I want to discuss the first poem, which is the text of which is on the handout, so I don't know if you'll be able to see that or not. I'm just going to, I was hoping you'd all have the handout in hard copy in front of you. So
We do.
we're going, you do, great.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. First poem
we have some
is
of it.
called Judas.
Some of it.
Always I lay upon the brink of love, impotent, waiting till the waters stirred, and no one healed my weakness with a word. For no words healed me without words to prove my heart, which, when the kiss of Mary wove his shroud, my tongueless anguish spurred to cool descent, and which each time I heard John whisper to him, moaned, but could not move. While Peter deeply drowsed within love's deep, I cramped upon its margin, glad to share the sop Christ gave me. Yet its bitter bite dried up my ducts. Praise Peter, who could weep his sin away, but never see me where I hang, huge teardrop on the cheek of night. So Miller here harmonizes the various gospel accounts of Judas, as well as referencing the Bull of Bethsaida in John 5. And it's a sonnet, but it's a very particular form of sonnet, a Petrarchian sonnet. And it's a dramatic monologue, a form that is the dramatic monologue I would go on to learn Miller favored particularly when engaging with biblical narratives and individuals, as we shall see. Real echoes of T.S. Eliot here, who she admired. At this poem's heart is Judas's inability to communicate, for no one healed my weakness with a word. For no words healed me without words to prove my heart. If Judas could speak, end his tongueless anguish, it would have been enough to open the floodgates of emotion and break the barrier between him and Christ. Silence, and more importantly, being silenced, is a recurring theme in Miller's large poetic output. Her collected poems, next slide please, published in 1991, is nearly 350 pages long. That's a substantial literary output. And this is not the silence. When she talks about silence that can be romanticized or even fetishized by schools of theology and spirituality, talking about enforced silence, the silence that one must wage war on, as one of her titles of one of her poems says. So you can see, I hope, what an arresting introduction Judith was to me, a completely unknown author. Who was Vassar Miller? Well, she was born in 1924 and lived her whole life in Houston, although she did travel around the United States and to Europe. She also lived her whole life with severe cerebral palsy. And before I go into more depth on Miller's disability, I want to, because I think she would have liked it this way, to explore briefly her life and the quality of her literary publications. Miller spoke a number of times at her resentment when she was pigeonholed as a disabled poet, or that the knowledge of her disability became the lens for reading her work. Now, her mother, also Vassar, died when Miller was only about a year old, and her father, a prosperous Houstonian developer, remarried. And Miller's stepmother would become a key figure in fighting for Vassar's education, taught her to read and write, persevered with the public school authorities, and eventually Vassar was able to enter mainstream schooling for her junior and senior high school education. It's a remarkable achievement for the mid-1930s. The University of Houston then followed, earning a BA and an MA in English. Now, her first volume of poetry, Adam's Footprint, was published in 1956, when she was 32. A major literary critic of the mid-century, Howard Nemerov, praised it positively in a piece on younger poets that he wrote for the Kenyon Review in 1958. Nemerov's praise was not unalloyed. He speaks of some lapses into sentimentality. Nonetheless, the poems, quote, are at their best brilliant works of language with fine energy, rich, strange, accurate, beautifully paced. And in a vivid turn of phrase, he says, quote, I mean, these are poems you can read over many times, as against the other kind, which, like Kleenex, is meant to be used only once and thrown away. That's quite never looked at Kleenex the same way again after that. Now, significantly for our purposes, Nemerov is writing in 1958, remember. He remarks, quote, since religious poetry is, of all things, the one most commonly supposed to have become impossible, it is doubly a pleasure to come upon the work of Vassar Miller. He's writing that in the late 1950s. And it could be said that publishing her first book in the 50s, she benefited from a kind of air pocket that had been carved out by the oxygen-sucking condescension of many critics for religious poetry, especially Christian poetry, by T.S. Eliot, who doesn't die till the 60s. But, I mean, Eliot was such an intellectual giant that people had to sort of concede that perhaps, a Christian could write religious poetry. But after Adam's Footprint, and from the 60s through the 80s, that pocket became smaller and the air much thinner for those who explored religious and mainly mainstream Christian themes. Tongue-in-cheek, I think, she once remarked that she felt more discriminated against for writing religious poetry than for having cerebral palsy. Now, over the course of these volumes, and I've given you on the handout a complete list of her publications, Miller's style and thinking developed. Her early work shows her attachment to traditional poetic forms like the sonnet. I mean, she's very, very attached to the sonnet, but she does become more experimental later. Her last volume of poetry, the evocatively named Struggling to Swim on Concrete, includes moving poems exploring loneliness, sexual desire, and religious themes such as prayer and the Eucharist. Thematically, she's very reminiscent of George Herbert, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. It also contains her technically brilliant sonnet sequence, Love's Bitten Tongue, a sequence of 22 English sonnets on the life and work of Christ, based on John Donne's La Corona sequence, also on the life of Christ. And in this poetic form, the last line of the sonnet is the first line of the next sonnet. It's technically very hard to do. And Miller outdoes Donne. La Corona had 7 stanzas. Her Love's Bitten Tongue has 22. One reviewer of Love's Bitten Tongue says that Miller harrows hell, which is quite a compliment to give a poet. Miller also edited what is believed to be the first of its kind, a literary anthology on disability, Despite This Flesh. Next slide, please. Perhaps unfashionable now, Miller was very clear that the anthology should deal exclusively with physical disability. 7 years before her death, her collected poems, along with a number of previously unpublished poems, were published, If I Had Wheels or Love, the collected poems of Vassar Miller. These are her major publications. Like many modern poets, her works are scattered across more than 50 anthologies, hundreds of periodicals, both in English and in translation. And every single book on the list you have is now out of print. So I want to now turn to her disability activism. I began with that quote from Miller from 1966. Jesus said, "Man shall not live by bread alone," but he said it to the devil, not to the hungry multitudes whom he fed. There's gospel action is a strong part of Miller's thinking. So along with this deep introspection of her poetry, there was a person of action. And it's worth remembering that the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, only became law in 1990, 8 years before Miller's death. Just briefly, I could say more about this, but I'd like to highlight 4 areas of her activism in the parish, the arts, academia, and publishing. First of all, the parish, if you could have the next slide. Miller was a member of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Houston, a progressive parish, the first one in the Diocese of Texas to call a woman as its rector, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Miller was made chair of their barrier-free committee, as they called it, to improve access. Nonetheless, she ran into barrier after barrier and was upbraided for parking her motorized scooter in the church porch. And she suggested in a blistering letter to the vestry that it be renamed the Party Crashers Committee, not the Barrier-Free Committee, because, quote, what is a greater party than the Holy Eucharist? It took her years, but she eventually got around to put in the church. Next slide, please. I think that's the ramp in question. Now, next slide, please. In the mid-1980s, she was also the driving force and honorary chair of the first ever arts festival for people with disabilities. And next slide, too, please. And there she is, her poetry, reading her poetry, and it's being interpreted by a signer. Next slide. She, in academia, she was a founder member of the editorial board of the academic journal Literature and Medicine, based in the US and still going strong. And lastly, next slide, her pioneering anthology mentioned earlier. Miller was adamant, as I said, that the criteria for inclusion in the anthology should be A, material of high literary quality, but focus on physical impairment and not on mental or psychological illness. Psychiatric illness and mental disabilities deserve an anthology of her own, was her view. She wasn't being unsympathetic, she just thought that they should be considered in different ways, and they produce different reactions in people. Her papers on the project reveal an extensive literary network. All her papers are at the University of Houston now. She had her finger on the pulse of American letters. Coherent criteria is important for any anthology, And Miller received submissions about cancer patients. A well-known poet wrote to her to say that time is a real handicap. Another wrote to say, quote, "We are all handicapped and some of us know it." Again, true, she wrote, quote, "But that is rather like telling the patients in a terminal ward that everyone is terminal." Miller is concerned to address those societal reactions and interpretations, many of which are rooted in the Christian tradition. For example, that the disabled person is magic or somehow superlatively gifted by God as some sort of blessing. She's often been told if she wasn't handicapped, she wouldn't write poetry. She says that's nonsense, of course. She writes powerfully, "The afflicted one is the bait dropped into the waters of chaos to catch whatever fish of meaning may surface to take it. And so let normal humanity know that, after all, everything is well." Or she writes in her introduction to this book, "The reverse can be true. The supernatural can be malign. Quote, the hunchback is evil, the blind man conniving, the cripple lecherous. Such afflictions are divine punishments for the biblical literalist and within the Christian tradition, of course. So I'd like to talk now a little bit about the sheer physicality of writing for Miller. Could we have the next slide, please? Now, a number of poems in her first collection, Adam's Footprint, address physical disability such as epitaph for a cripple. Miller uses words like spastic and cripple, for which I apologize, but it's not my place to edit Vassar Miller. This is the next poem on your handout. Note here, this is an early poem of hers, note here how each verse begins with a part of the body. Feet that floundering go, no way of your own will, none with eternity. You now have gained your goal. Fingers writhe from weaving like crabs with claws torn loose. You mold in your unmoving the perfect shape of peace. Tongue entangled in the ravels of confusion. You have learned silence soon, the language of precision. Body, wry reproach to athlete mind. Lie down, your lover limbs here couch, graced with the state of stone. Miller speaks of body's wry reproach to athlete mind, which reminds us that writing is not only a creative process, but a physical one. And as many of you know, cerebral palsy is a disability on a spectrum of severity. And one of Miller's great friends and promoters of her poetry was a professor of English at Millersville University in Pennsylvania, Bruce Kellner. He died in 2019, so I never had the chance to speak to him about her. He is an invaluable source, though, for piecing together a biography for Miller. And following her death in 1998, he wrote an appreciation of her in a special issue of the journal Literature and Medicine, the journal on which she was on the founding editorial board. So this is Kellner, a dear friend, describing her. She was virtually helpless, her arms and legs flailing or contracting awkwardly, and her voice an impenetrable series of graveled groanings. Following her conversation was nearly impossible. One hand had atrophied. She usually walked with someone at her elbow. She drooled. She went up and down steps one at a time from a sitting position. And I thought it important to tell you about her accomplishments as a poet and as an activist before reading out that description. So, body, wry reproach to athlete mind. How did she manage physically to be such a productive author? Next slide, please. Miller's creativity was liberated by technology. It's called a typewriter, and I've included a picture for younger members of the audience who may not know what one of these was. I've already mentioned that Miller's stepmother successfully educated her at home so that she could go into mainstream education. and she started writing poetry when she was 8. Her father lugged home every evening this big office typewriter. She writes, I began, quoting her, fooling around with words and found I could make up sentences that rhyme. In an interview in 1983, Miller remarks that all she needs to write is a typewriter. For years, a manual, quote, but now I have an electric, which has spoiled me. It has enabled me to use more than one finger. I now use 3. In her papers held at the University of Houston, some items from the 1980s were clearly produced on a dot matrix printer. Remember those? And indicating the early use of a word processor for her. And in another interview, Miller comments in a prescient way that computers will be revolutionary for people with disabilities. But let's stick with this older technology, this Underwood. Technology which revolutionized life for Miller. The next poem on your handout, Subterfuge, was first published in her Selected and New Poems in 1981. And it tells of that very incident I've been describing, that she describes, of her father arriving home from the office with the old Underwood. So, Subterfuge. I remember my father, slight, staggering in with his Underwood, bearing it in his arms like an awkward bouquet for his spastic child, who sits down on the floor, one knee on the frame of the typewriter, and holding her left wrist with her right hand, in that precision known to the crippled, pecks at the keys with a sparrow's preoccupation, falling by chance on rhyme, novel and curious bubble, blown with magic pipe. She tries them over and over, spellbound by life's clashing in accord or against itself, pretending pretense and playing at playing. She does her childhood backward, as children do, her fun a delaying action against what she knows. My father must lose her run away on her treadmill, will lose that terrible favor that life has done him, as she toils at tomorrow, tensed by her makeshift toy. So the physicality of this poem is very commanding. The child who sits down on the floor, one knee on the frame of the typewriter to hold it in place, and holding her left wrist with her right hand, in that precision known to the crippled, pecks at the keys with a sparrow's preoccupation. The sheer effort of one knee on the frame of the typewriter, you can just feel it in that poem. As in the autobiographical fragment I've cited above, the gift of the Underwood, her father bearing it in his arms like an awkward bouquet, allowed her to start fooling around with words, and I found I could make up sentences that rhyme. That's rendered in the poem as falling by chance on rhyme, novel and curious bubble, blown with magic pipe. She tries them over and over, spellbound by life's clashing in accord or against itself. It is playing at playing. Subterfuge, of course, can mean a stratagem to justify one's conduct or to conceal one's true attitude, a smokescreen. But subterfuge has a rarer meaning, which I feel Miller must have known, and that is as a source or place of shelter and protection. A friend of hers and one of her publishers comments that for Miller, the typewriter became an instrument of transformation as she toils at her tomorrow, her future vocation as a poet perhaps, tensed at her makeshift toy. Now, I just want to touch briefly, I've still got a few more minutes, I think. I want to touch briefly on Miller's insights and reflections on the priesthood and her own relationship with the rector of St. Stephen's in the 1980s and 90s, the Reverend Helen Havens. Could have the next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. There is Vassar with Helen Havens. Miller had both deep affection and respect for the clergy, along with a critical eye for pomposity and self-regard, so no shortage of material there. And she could be scathing when she felt that a clergy person was more performance of the priesthood than inhabiting the priesthood. Now, I mentioned that St. Stephen's, where Helen was the rector, was the first parish in the Diocese of Texas to call a woman as a rector, 1981. Now, she wasn't a native of Texas, but she had attended Houston's Rice University. And Havens was in the early cohort of women ordained in the Episcopal Church after the canons were regularized, priested in 1977 in the Diocese of Texas, but not by the then Bishop of Texas. He would not ordain Havens, but he did allow the then Bishop of the Rio Grande to come to Houston to conduct the ordination. I'm sure many people are familiar with those stories. The discernment process in the 1970s was bruising, if not brutal, and Havens recalls being told that, quote, she was emotionally disturbed and in need of extensive therapy because she was seeking ordination. Rather remarkably, Miller's conflict with the vestry and other parish leaders over the issues of access in the 1980s, Havens appears never to have been in her firing line. In one of the 3 poems dedicated to Havens, she alludes to the long struggle for ordination that Havens' generation experienced. This is from a poem called Thanksgiving. Lovely lady glowing white, stand sterner lest you falter. Preaching Christ, you too must fight, always at his altar. Perhaps Miller recognized in Havens someone who'd been tested about different kinds of access issues. Now, Miller's 3 published poems about Havens are loving and appreciative, but I think this is what saves them from sentimentality or deferential clericalism, is that all of Miller's poetic reflections on priesthood and on priests, and there are other poems that aren't specifically about Havens, are always placed in the larger and greater context of the Eucharist. And in that and many other ways, one can detect the influence of George Herbert, the great 17th century Anglican poet, in Miller's poems on the priesthood. In both cases, Herbert and Miller, the putting on of the appropriate garment, which is the putting on of Christ, features a Pauline reference, of course, as well. And on your handout, I have put George Herbert's most famous poem, Aaron on the Priesthood, and I'm not going to read it out, but note the parts I put in bold. For Herbert, Aaron, the poet-priest, is disabled by his awareness of his own inadequacy compared to true Aaron's. In contrasting the priestly apparel of holiness, so he says, holiness on the head, light and perfections on the breast, thus are true Aaron's dressed. But Herbert finds profaneness on my head, defects and darkness in my breast. Poor priest, thus am I dressed. Again, references to parts of the body. But the poem is resolved, Herbert's doubts are resolved by the grace of putting on Christ, who, quote, lives in me while I do rest. Come people, Aaron's dressed. Now, these Herbertian characteristics are best displayed in her poem for Helen on her birthday, which is the last poem on your handout, I hope. It is an eloquent, carefully structured with a playful rhyme scheme and resonates with Herbert's Aaron. So here we go. For Helen on her birthday. I do not kneel to you, and yet, my dear, I do. For who knows what God desires, what reverence requires? The heart of the Eucharist means no one except Christ. And still I can pay homage to none save God's one image, to see who must be in heaven itself. Yet here the leaven of human care are those in whom we find repose, at least a little while. Wherefore your glance, your smile, must serve the narrow space I pass through, till his face may bless have in his stead your hand light on my head. The poem is about Havens. It's a birthday present for her after all, and yet it's not. The heart of the Eucharist means no one except Christ. Herbert's Aaron is invoked as each stanza begins with a reference to the head, holiness on the head. Miller ends with your hand light upon my head in blessing. Another poem of Herbert's, the Holy Communion, exclaims, before that sin turned flesh to stone, and all our lump to leaven, a fervent sigh might well have blown our innocent earth to heaven. Havens' priestly ministry is in Miller's poem, and yet here the leaven of human care are those in whom we find repose, at least a little while. Because of that, wherefore your glance, your smile, must serve the narrow space I pass through, till his face may bless, have in his stead your hand light upon my head. So this is inhabiting, not performing the priesthood. Next slide, please. And Havens did just that at the chief celebrant at Miller's funeral in November 1998 at St. Stephen's as the order of service. Her friend, the Baptist minister in this progressive Baptist church she also attended, preached a wonderful sermon at that service. So it's absolutely a prayer book right to funeral, but ecumenical. So just to conclude, next slide, please. I hope I've opened up to a new audience, a poet of remarkable gifts, an Episcopalian of remarkable gifts, who has lived a remarkable life. Miller tells us that Christianity, quoting her here, Christianity is the religion of the Word made flesh, and poetry is its most natural voice. Next slide, please. It is in poetry where Vassar Miller found her most natural voice, and there she is being applauded. So that seems a good way to end the paper. Thank you.
Look at you with your shirt. Love it.
Thank you, Judith.
Sure, sorry about any technical hitches.
No worries.
Great.
Does anyone have questions? Joe?
Do you have other plans for your research on Miller?
Do you have other plans for your research on Miller?
Yes, I'm working. I hope to write a book about her, and I've been giving lectures and talks on her since about 2024. I was invited to give the Costa lectures at Virginia Theological Seminary, and on the handout are the links for those. And that was very, very good because it forced, since I'm almost 3 years into my retirement, and I don't know about you, but I need deadlines to write. And so VTS, God bless them, gave me a very firm deadline, and you know, they were going to be public lectures and streamed, so there was no messing about. So I was able to, in 3 lectures, of course, explore quite wide aspects of her. Much more. There's much more in those lectures actually on the poetry, but also about her disability activism and also her Episcopalianism. I think that's a very important part of Miller, and it was the liturgy and the Eucharist that drew her into St. Stephen's, and she talks about her family was Presbyterian, but they used to go to St. Stephen's for midnight mass on Christmas. So never diss the the potency of midnight mass for people. And that was her sort of flavor of it. And out of that, when she became an adult, she wanted to go to St. Stephen's and became a member. She had her ups and downs with the congregation. and also participated in Covenant Baptist Church in Houston, which was a breakaway Baptist church from the Southern Baptists, because they wanted to actually address issues like desegregation and so forth. And that was another issue for, Miller was very much on the social justice side of things as well. So, wish me luck. I'm going to sort of, got quite a bit written now, but I need later this summer to start, do a book proposal and get on with it. Yeah.
Hi, I might have misheard you, but I thought you might have said that her books of poetry are out of print. But I'm looking on Amazon and actually seeing that some of them are available. So
yeah, I think they're out of print but available in secondhand copy.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah. And there's a really good, there's a great website called Bookfinder, all one word, bookfinder.com. And I was able to find everything of hers on there.
Okay, great. Thank Bookfinder, thank you.
Yeah, bookfinder.com. But she, it's, I know poetry is not a big seller for, doesn't make publishers a lot of money unless you're, T.S. Eliot or something. Or Mary Oliver. But it seems a pity that, she's out of print. And it may be the book about her may help to get a new edition of something.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much, Judith. I hope it's not too late where you are.
No, it's still light outside here. It doesn't get dark till about 10 this time of year. So,
thank you for introducing her to us.
That's great. I hope you all having a good conference.
Yeah.
I think everyone here was looking up for her poetry as you were talking, so I think you've got a lot of fans today.
Good,
So.
right. Well, we need a Vassar Miller movement.
Yes.
And I think she should be in the calendar of the Episcopal Church. That's another thing I'd like to see.
Thank you, Judith.
Okay, thank you. Bye. Take care.